Throughout American history, the disabled were seen as second-class citizens and never given the opportunity of the American dream. They were rejected and pushed to the margins of society. Many physical and psychological barriers denied the disabled from accessing resources such as employment, healthcare, and in some cases, even the right to marriage. They were desperate for change, but the disabled were forced to suffer in silence without a suitable path of resistance. But then, the perfect opportunity arose. The Capitol crawl was the beacon of hope that they were looking for. National attention was directed towards the protest, resulting in pressure on Congress and a shift in public perception. The Capitol crawl was one of the most influential events that led to the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, a piece of legislation that would change the lives of millions of disabled Americans for the better. As far back as the 1800s, legislation dubbed ugly laws legalized discrimination against the disabled, which prohibited them from being seen in public. In 1867, San Francisco became the first city to introduce these laws, with other major cities following suit. The Supreme Court inexplicably protected this practice in the case Buck v. Bell. Despite the prejudice, the disabled rights movement began picking up steam during the early 1900s.
There was a group in the 1930s called the League of the Physically Handicapped that formed in New York City and tried to challenge the exclusion of people with disabilities from some of the 1930s New Deal programs of the federal government.
As soldiers returned home from the Second World War, society warmly welcomed them, and the government established assistance programs. While these changes were significant steps forward in the disabled rights movement, they still did not do nearly enough to protect the rights of all disabled Americans. However, the disability rights movement would make slow progress with the signing of Section 504. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 prohibited discrimination based on disabilities in federally funded programs and made accommodation for special needs students. Soon after the passage, it was realized that the bill had shortcomings. For example, it did not apply to private businesses and undercovered many small and individual healthcare plans. Fortunately, the most pivotal piece of legislation was on its way. In April 1988, the 100th Congress, composed of Senators Lowell Weicker of Connecticut and Tom Harkin of Iowa, proposed Section 2345, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1988. The ADA was a comprehensive civil rights law that would affect all aspects of the public and private sector, differentiating itself from the earlier legislation like Section 504, which solely applied to beneficiaries of government assistance. Once passed, the law would declare discrimination against the disabled as unconstitutional, while also giving every disabled American greater access to employment and the ability to take advantage of services provided at public restaurants, bathrooms, and medical offices. On September 7, 1989, the ADA passed in the Senate by a 76-8 vote. However, many felt that progress was being made too slow and feared that it would never be passed in the House of Representatives.
So we were able to get it through the Senate. But then it went to the House of Representatives, and it got all boxed up in several different committees and subcommittees, and one committee chairman, a member of my own party, did not want the bill. And so it just languished there.
Numerous groups lobbied hundreds of thousands of dollars to kill the bill, such as the Association of Christian Schools International, who feared they would have to implement costly changes to their churches if they were labeled as a public group, as well as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who felt the bill would hinder the growth of the economy by diverting funding away from struggling small businesses. The National Federation of Independent Businesses called the bill a disaster. This divided opinion prompted the House to stall the bill, hoping the disabled community would soon forget about the ADA. However, the disabled community had had enough. Far too long have their voices been silenced. Far too long have their dreams been smothered. And far too long have their cries been unanswered. After decades of prejudice, underrepresentation, and suffering, disabled Americans were determined to place the ADA on the front page of the legislative agenda. On March 12, 1990, to put the media's attention on the ADA, a crowd of over 1,000 disabled protesters arrived at the Capitol building to demand the passage of the ADA and illustrate the struggles they faced. Protesters abandoned their wheelchairs and crutches and climbed the 83 steps of the Capitol. 8-year-old Jennifer Keelan became a nationwide icon and leader for the protest, Although the protest was only meant for adults, Keelan would not let that deny her opportunity to make a difference. Despite the noise, dehydration, sweat, and tears, she continued to climb the steps and inspire the hundreds of participants at the Capitol building and touch the hearts of millions of Americans watching at home.
I knew at that moment that I was not only representing myself, but I was representing my generation.
The Capitol crawl garnered national media attention. It was broadcasted on the nation's biggest media outlets, reaching Americans from all corners of the country while knocking on the doorstep of America's most powerful lawmakers.
It was absolutely a turning point, absolutely a watershed moment, because that was really when images of, disabled people struggling for normal public accommodation hit every, living room in America.
Like the March on Washington organized by Martin Luther King Jr., the Capitol crawl won the hearts and minds of millions of Americans. News of the protest spread like wildfire, along with it, the idea of change. As a result of the actions taken by the brave and spirited heroes on March 12th, the ADA solidified its place on the congressional agenda.
I'm telling you, within just a couple of weeks, we got that bill out of the House of Representatives. I knew at that point we were going to get it done. It was a defining moment that crystallized everybody in the country as to how unfair things were.
Even though there was still opposition to the bill being passed due to monetary concerns, public pressure was simply too great and the government had no choice but to pass the bill. The House began consideration of the ADA in May of 1990. Numerous attempts were made to weaken the provisions of the bill, but they were all outvoted by wide margins. The bill passed the House by a convincing vote of 403 to 20 on May 22, 1990. After the bill passed on July 13, 1990, Senator Tom Harkin delivered a speech on the Senate floor in American Sign Language, the first ASL speech in the history of the Senate.
From March to July was record time. Usually, it takes a couple years of debates between, especially for legislation so sweeping, to be implemented.
Finally, on July 26, 1990, President George H.W. Bush signed the ADA into law. Millions of Americans watched as Bush built the bridge to amend the disconnect from society that the disabled faced for decades. Within 4 months of the Capitol crawl, disabled Americans finally achieved what they've worked for.
Today's legislation brings us closer to that day when no Americans will ever again be deprived of their basic guarantee of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
The passage of the ADA was a significant cornerstone in American history, another bill that would have been left untouched by Congress had it not been for the Capitol crawl. The disabled fought an uphill battle to cross the prominent frontier of discrimination and stigma. Provisions of the ADA are now visible in daily life. Flat and ramped entrances into buildings are now commonplace. Designated disability parking spaces can be found in most parking lots. Millions of disabled Americans now have access to public services which most of us take for granted. People with disabilities who were once denied employment solely because of their condition now hold high-ranking positions in businesses and the government. While the ADA focused on improving physical hardships, its implementation destigmatized the societal partiality towards the disabled. However, to say that everything has been trouble-free following the signing of the ADA would be inaccurate. Sadly, many older buildings don't provide accommodations, and many disabled Americans still struggle to find jobs. As a result, disability rights activists are still fighting to improve and increase accessibility. Although the fight for disability rights still continues today, no event had an impact as influential and widespread as the ADA and Capitol crawl.
It also just serves as a beacon of hope for the disabled community. They weren't just climbing any building, they were climbing the halls of power.
Protesters climbed the steps of the Capitol, demanding social reform, demanding political change, and demanding to be valued as equal Americans. As the legacy of the Capitol crawl continues, and the efforts of the protesters persist, the voices of the disabled will never be silenced again.